Hey guys, tonight we're descending into one of history's most thankless jobs, the medieval castle dungeon guard post. Picture this. You're standing at the top of a narrow stone staircase, torch flickering in your hand, and below you stretches an underground labyrinth of suffering that you're now responsible for monitoring. The air rising from below hits your face like a physical thing, thick, warm, and carrying smells you don't yet have names for. Your new supervisor claps you on the shoulder, says something about keeping the devils contained, and disappears back up into the blessed daylight you're already mourning. Welcome to your new life. Spoiler alert, you're probably not going to make it through the week with your sanity intact, and there's a decent chance you won't make it through physically either. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing the global bedtime crew checking in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You descend those stone steps for the first time, and each footfall echoes in a way that makes you acutely aware you're entering a different world. The castle dungeon isn't what Hollywood has prepared you for. There's no dramatic organ music, no convenient wall-mounted torches that burn eternally, no clean separation between good guy guard zone and bad guy prisoner zone. What you get instead is a cramped, converted storage basement that the castle architect designed for wine barrels, not human beings. When the Lord decided he needed somewhere to put people he didn't want wandering around, someone just pointed at the lowest, dampest space available and said, "That'll do." The medieval castle dungeon, the real one you're now trapped working in, is typically a series of small chambers carved into the foundation or built into the base of a tower. Some castles repurposed old Roman cisterns or natural cave systems. The Castle of Chillon in Switzerland, for instance, has dungeon spaces that were literally hewn from bedrock beneath the structure, creating a series of Gothic arch chambers that stay cold year-round regardless of season. Your particular posting might be in a converted undercroft or perhaps in the basement of a keep, or, if you're especially unlucky, in an oubliette, which is just a fancy French word for a bottle-shaped pit where people are dropped through a trapdoor and basically forgotten. The term comes from oublier, meaning to forget, which should tell you everything about the level of care involved. The first thing that strikes you as you reach the bottom of the stairs is how wrong your spatial awareness feels. Your torch barely penetrates the darkness 15 feet ahead. The ceiling presses down, maybe 7 feet high if you're lucky, often lower. These spaces weren't designed for comfort or ease of movement. They were designed to be difficult, to be disorienting, to remove every trace of human dignity from their occupants. But here's the thing nobody mentioned during your hiring. You're going to spend 12 to 16 hours at a stretch down here too. This isn't a place you visit to check on prisoners and then leave. This is your office. This is where you eat your meals, where you sit and wait through the endless nothing-happening hours, where you'll eventually fall asleep despite your best efforts not to. The walls around you weep. Not metaphorically, literally weep. Moisture condenses on the stone constantly because these spaces sit below the water table or at best right at its edge. Your torch hisses when droplets hit it. The floor beneath your feet isn't solid stone, but rather a layer of compacted filth covered with whatever straw was last thrown down to absorb the moisture. In some more sophisticated operations, there might be actual paving stones, but in most medieval dungeons, you're walking on centuries of compressed organic matter that's achieved a kind of geological permanence. Every step releases a small puff of smell, not the main overwhelming stench, but little preview whiffs that hint at what's to come as your nose adjusts. You pass the first cell, and a face appears at the small barred opening. The prisoner doesn't say anything, just watches you with an intensity that makes your skin crawl. You're still fresh enough that you try to look authoritative, but your heart's pounding because you've just realized something crucial. You're down here alone with these people. Sure, there's another guard supposedly on duty, but you haven't seen him yet, and the architecture of this place means someone could be screaming 20 feet away, and you might not hear them clearly. The stone does weird things to sound, creating echoes and dead zones in equal measure. Your post, your actual physical station, is a wooden stool near a junction where you can theoretically monitor 2 corridors at once. There's a small shelf carved into the wall that holds the shift log, a pathetic stub of candle, and something that might have been an apple 3 weeks ago. The previous guard has scratched a tally into the wall. You count the marks. 47. You have no idea what they're counting, and that uncertainty will gnaw at you. The dungeon you're now responsible for might hold anywhere from 3 to 30 prisoners, depending on your castle's size and importance. Major fortress prisons like the Tower of London operated on a completely different scale, but you're not working at a major fortress. You're working at a mid-tier lord's castle where the dungeon serves multiple purposes: holding prisoners awaiting trial, containing criminals serving sentences, storing political hostages, and occasionally housing enemies captured in local conflicts. The distinction between these categories will become important because each type of prisoner requires different handling, offers different dangers, and comes with different consequences if you screw up their supervision. The lighting situation becomes your first practical crisis. You have 1 torch that's already burned through a quarter of its useful life just getting down here and doing your initial walkthrough. You have 3 more torches allocated for your shift. Basic math tells you that's not enough. A medieval torch, a bundle of pitch-soaked rags wrapped around a wooden core, burns for roughly 30 to 45 minutes if you're lucky. Maybe an hour if someone made it really well. You're expected to be down here for 12 hours minimum. That's somewhere between 16 and 24 torches needed for continuous light, but you have 4. The message is clear. You're expected to spend most of your shift in darkness or near darkness, conserving light for when you absolutely need it. This is when you first understand that your job isn't really about guarding prisoners in the active sense, preventing escapes or stopping violence. Your job is about existing down here as a human presence so that the prisoners can't claim abandonment, and so that if someone dies, there's a witness who can swear they were alive at the start of the shift. You're less a security guard and more a living timestamp. The actual security comes from the iron chains, the locked doors, the elevation of the castle itself, and the fact that even if a prisoner somehow got free, they'd still be inside a fortress surrounded by walls, guards, and people loyal to the lord who put them here. You try to get comfortable on your stool. It's positioned deliberately where the damp is worst, ensuring you can't relax enough to fall deeply asleep. The stone behind you radiates a cold that seems to actively seek out your body heat and devour it. You're wearing whatever clothing passed for your uniform, probably a rough wool tunic, maybe a leather jerkin if your employer felt generous. But it's nowhere near enough for the constant 50-degree dampness that defines underground life. Within an hour, you're shivering despite not actually being cold enough for that to make physiological sense. It's the wet that does it, the moisture in the air that settles on your skin and conducts heat away faster than your medieval clothing technology can replace it. From somewhere deeper in the dungeon complex, you hear a cough, then another, then a long, rattling series that ends in spitting. You can't tell if it's from a prisoner or from your fellow guard who you still haven't located. The acoustic properties down here make everything sound both closer and more distant than it actually is. Conversations seem to originate from inside the walls. Footsteps echo from contradictory directions. You'll later learn that prisoners exploit this deliberately, creating sounds from their cells that seem to come from the corridor, making you investigate empty spaces while they enjoy the private entertainment of your confusion. The first rat you see is the size of a small cat. It doesn't scurry away from your torchlight, but instead pauses, evaluates you with disturbing intelligence, and then proceeds along its route with the confidence of something that knows it belongs here more than you do. Medieval rats in dungeon environments grew large because they had unlimited access to food, water, warmth from human bodies, and an absence of predators. These weren't the nervous, twitchy creatures you might encounter in a modern subway. These were apex predators of their environment, bold enough to bite sleeping humans and comfortable enough to raise families in the straw 6 feet from where you're sitting. You notice that your torch is attracting insects, not just attracting them, summoning them in swarms from cracks in the stonework you didn't know existed. They spiral around the flame in manic devotions, occasionally flying into it and creating tiny pops and flares that cast wild shadows across the walls. Some make it past the flame and land on your face, your neck, crawling into your hair. You try to wave them away, but that requires taking your attention off the dark corridors, off the cells you're supposed to be monitoring, and the moment you focus on the insects, you become aware that you've lost track of the sounds around you. There's a splash from somewhere, water dripping into a collection point, someone dumping a waste bucket, a rat falling into a puddle. You can't tell, and the uncertainty keeps your nervous system activated at a low-grade panic level that you'll maintain for the duration of your employment. This is the exhaustion they don't warn you about, not physical tiredness from hard labor, but the mental exhaustion of perpetual vigilance in an environment designed to obscure information. Your brain keeps trying to build a threat assessment model, keeps trying to categorize and predict dangers, but it can't because the data is always incomplete and contradictory. Historians still argue whether dungeon guard posts were deliberately designed to be psychologically taxing for the guards themselves, or whether the miserable conditions were simply a side effect of pragmatic construction and nobody in charge cared enough to improve them. Some scholars point to certain castle designs where the guard stations seem almost purposefully exposed to the worst environmental conditions, suggesting that lords wanted guards who were miserable enough to take out their frustrations on prisoners, creating an extra layer of punishment through proxy suffering. Other historians counter that this grants too much sophisticated psychological insight to medieval castle designers who were primarily concerned with defensive architecture and cost efficiency. Your first hour crawls past. You've checked each cell twice, confirmed the chains are secured, verified that the prisoners are alive and present. Now what? This is the reality of guard work that makes people quit. The crushing boredom punctuated by moments of terror. You have nothing to do. There are no smartphones to scroll, no books to read, assuming you're even literate, which statistically you're probably not, no radio, no podcast, no distraction whatsoever from the combination of sensory assault and cognitive emptiness that defines your workspace. So you sit on your damp stool, in the insufficient light of your carefully rationed torch, listening to the sounds of human suffering mixed with water dripping and rats chittering, slowly understanding that you've made a terrible mistake accepting this position. And you're only 1 hour into a 12-hour shift. You have 11 more to go. Then you get to climb those stairs, breathe fresh air for a blessed moment, and come back down tomorrow to do it all again. The dungeon doesn't care about your regrets. It simply waits, patient and eternal, for you to either adapt or break. The stench hits you in layers, and that's the part that breaks most new guards within their first week. You thought you understood what bad smell meant before you took this job. Maybe you worked near a tannery, or lived downwind from a slaughterhouse, or had the misfortune of cleaning out a privy in summer. Congratulations, you were training in the minor leagues. What you're experiencing now is the championship-level assault on your olfactory system, and unlike those other smells that you could walk away from, this one is your entire working environment for the next however many months you last. The first layer is human waste, and not the tidy, relatively contained version you're used to from properly maintained latrines. In the dungeon, prisoners relieve themselves into buckets if they're lucky, onto the straw if they're not, or in some particularly grim operations, they're chained in positions where they simply soil themselves and remain that way until someone decides to hose down the cell. You're that someone, by the way. That's part of your job description that somehow didn't come up during hiring. The waste sits in warm, damp conditions that accelerate decomposition, releasing ammonia compounds that make your eyes water and your throat burn. After about 3 hours of exposure, you'll notice that the inside of your nose feels raw, like you've been breathing sandpaper. That's the ammonia literally damaging your mucous membranes. But you can't just breathe through your mouth to avoid it, because then you taste it. The particles become flavor. Your brain, desperately trying to categorize the sensory input into something manageable, decides that breathing through your mouth means you're eating whatever you're smelling, and suddenly you're gagging, bent over, trying not to vomit, because if you vomit down here, that just adds to the problem and you'll have to smell your own partially digested dinner mixing with everything else. Some guards carry herbs, lavender, mint, rosemary if you can afford it, pressed into small pouches that they hold near their noses. It helps approximately as much as holding an umbrella helps during a hurricane. The gesture is optimistic but ultimately futile. The second layer is rotting straw and organic decay. The straw that covers the dungeon floors is changed irregularly at best. In well-run operations, it might be replaced monthly. In poorly run dungeons, which is most of them, it might be replaced twice a year, or whenever it's compacted down so thoroughly that it stops performing even its minimal absorbent function. This straw contains everything: urine, feces, vomit, blood from wounds or beatings, food scraps, dead insects, occasionally dead rats, and the accumulated shed skin cells and hair from everyone who's occupied this space. Ferments. That's the actual technical term. The biological material in the straw undergoes anaerobic decomposition, creating methane, hydrogen sulfide, and various organic acids that produce a sweet, rotten smell that coats the back of your throat like oil. You'll develop a cough within your first week that you'll never completely shake as long as you work here. It's your lungs trying to expel the particulate matter you're constantly inhaling, fungal spores from the decomposing straw, bacteria colonies that have achieved airborne status, and simple dust particles that carry concentrated essence of dungeon on every molecule. Medieval physicians had no concept of airborne pathogens, but they understood empirically that bad air, what they called miasma, made people sick. They were right about the correlation even if their causation theory needed work. The dungeon air is objectively bad for you, filling your lungs with material that will shorten your lifespan with every breath. The third layer is the smell of infected wounds. Prisoners in medieval dungeons rarely receive medical care. A gash from chains rubbing against skin, a broken bone that heals crooked, an abscess from a bad tooth. These conditions just persist and worsen. Infected tissue develops its own distinctive smell, a sickly sweet putrefaction that's somehow worse than the clean smell of fresh decay. It's the smell of living tissue dying while still attached to a living person. You can identify which cells contain prisoners with serious infections just by walking the corridor with your nose, no torch required. The smell precedes them by 10 feet. Some prisoners develop gangrene, particularly in their extremities where chains have cut off circulation or where frostbite has set in during winter months. Gangrene comes in two varieties, dry and wet. Dry gangrene smells like old leather and rot, unpleasant but tolerable. Wet gangrene smells like death decided to become liquid and then throw a party. It's the smell of tissue literally liquefying while bacteria throw a feeding frenzy. You'll encounter prisoners with black, oozing extremities who beg you for a clean death because the infection is spreading and they know, even with medieval medical knowledge, that they're dying slowly. You have no authority to grant that mercy. You can only document their continued existence on your shift log and move on. The fourth layer is the smell of death itself when prisoners don't survive their confinement. In theory, dead prisoners are removed promptly. In practice, if someone dies during your shift, they might not be retrieved until the end of the day or the next day, or whenever someone in authority decides that corpse removal is a priority worth allocating resources toward. Bodies in warm, damp environments begin active decomposition within hours. The smell of human decomposition is apparently one of those scents that triggers deep evolutionary recognition in our brains. You'll know immediately what it is even if you've never smelled it before. Your body identifies it at a primal level as danger, disease, death, avoid at all costs. Except you can't avoid it because it's literally your job to remain present. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely less sensitive to terrible smells due to constant exposure, or whether this is a myth we tell ourselves about the past to make their living conditions seem more bearable than they were. Evidence suggests that medieval people actually complained constantly about bad smells, went to considerable effort to mask them with perfumes and herbs, and structured their cities with waste management as a serious concern. They weren't nose-blind to their environment, they just had fewer options for addressing the problem. You, standing in this dungeon, are experiencing the same smells that would have disgusted a medieval person just as much as they disgust you. They didn't have a magical historical tolerance for stench. They just endured it because the alternative was not eating. Around hour 4 of your shift, you'll notice that your sense of smell has started to adapt. Not in a good way, more like your brain has triaged the situation and decided that since you can't escape the smell, it will simply allocate fewer processing resources to analyzing it. The smell becomes background, the way the hum of a refrigerator becomes something you stop consciously noticing. But here's the cruel trick. It hasn't actually gone away, and every time you move to a different part of the dungeon or a door opens or air circulation changes, you get a fresh hit that reminds you exactly how bad it is. Your brain keeps trying to establish a new baseline of normal, and the environment keeps resetting it. You'll also discover that the smell follows you home. It saturates your clothing, your hair, your skin. Medieval people didn't have the option of daily showers or effective laundry detergent. You might wash your face and hands in cold water from a bucket, maybe dunk your head if you're feeling ambitious, but the smell has bonded with you at a molecular level. Your family members will be able to identify your profession from 50 feet away. Children will avoid you. Dogs will bark. You become a social pariah not because of your character, but because you smell like a walking biohazard, and nothing in your technological arsenal can fix it. Some guards try to fight the smell with fire, burning herbs or incense in small braziers. This creates a new problem: smoke accumulation in spaces with poor ventilation. Now you're breathing smoke along with everything else. And while the burning rosemary or sage might mask the dungeon smell for 3 feet around the brazier, it doesn't actually eliminate the source. You're just adding more particulate matter to the air, giving your lungs extra work, and creating a fire hazard in a space built from stone and timber where an uncontrolled fire could easily trap and kill everyone present. The worst shifts are summer. You might think winter would be worse, but you'd be wrong in an interesting way. Summer brings heat, and heat accelerates every biological process that creates smell. The bacterial colonies in the straw go into reproductive overdrive. Decomposition speeds up. Prisoners sweat more, adding fresh moisture to an already saturated environment. The air becomes soup, thick, warm, and carrying flavor molecules that coat your tongue despite your best efforts to breathe shallowly. You'll lose weight during summer shifts not from physical exertion, but because eating becomes nearly impossible when every breath you take makes you nauseous. Food tastes like dungeon no matter what you're actually eating. Your appetite vanishes. You become thin and haggard, and people in the castle above start to comment on how unhealthy you look. Winter has its own challenges. The cold makes the damp more penetrating, and prisoners who are already weakened by confinement start dying from exposure, but at least the smell is somewhat suppressed by lower temperatures. Bacterial growth slows. Decomposition rates drop. It's still terrible, but it's terrible at a reduced intensity. Summer is when guards quit in highest numbers, when people simply walk off the job mid-shift because their bodies reject the environment so completely that remaining seems worse than whatever punishment quitting might bring. There's a specific subcategory of smell that deserves its own mention: the bucket situation. Prisoners are theoretically provided with wooden buckets for waste. These buckets get emptied irregularly and often incompletely. Over time, the wood absorbs the waste, becoming permanently contaminated. The buckets themselves become smell generators, radiating their concentrated funk even when technically empty. You're responsible for the bucket system, collecting them, dumping them into a larger cesspit or directly into a moat or river depending on castle design, and returning them to cells. This is arguably the worst part of your job, worse even than the violence or danger, because it's routine, frequent, and unavoidably intimate. You're handling containers of human waste multiple times per shift, trying not to spill them, trying not to breathe, trying not to think about what you're doing. Some castles tried to engineer solutions to the waste problem. The famous garderobe system, basically a toilet chute built into the castle wall that emptied directly outside, occasionally extended to dungeon levels, creating slightly better conditions. But garderobe chutes in dungeons came with their own problems. They created potential escape routes, required expensive construction, and in winter, cold air would blast up through the chute, freezing prisoners who were already barely surviving. Most dungeons just stuck with buckets and accepted that everything would smell terrible. You'll learn to identify prisoners by smell without seeing them. The man in the third cell has diabetes. You don't know that diagnosis, but you recognize the sweet, fruity smell of his ketotic breath that precedes him when he talks. The woman in the end chamber has a dental abscess. Her breath carries that distinctive rot and pus smell that makes you turn away even when you need to speak with her. The prisoner who was tortured last week smells like burned meat mixed with infection because his wounds cauterized but then became contaminated. You become an expert in the grammar of human biological decay, able to read stories of disease and suffering written in scent molecules. Your sense of taste becomes permanently altered. Even on your days off, when you're eating food prepared by your wife or mother or whoever manages meals in your household, you'll notice phantom dungeon flavors. Your brain has associated eating with the smell environment of your workplace so completely that the two experiences have merged. Other guards understand. You can always identify fellow dungeon guards in a tavern because they're the ones eating without enthusiasm, mechanically consuming calories out of biological necessity rather than pleasure, sometimes pausing mid-bite with expressions that suggest they're tasting something that isn't on their plate. The psychological impact of constant smell exposure doesn't get discussed in medieval sources because the vocabulary for discussing psychological trauma basically didn't exist yet. But you experience it nonetheless. The smell invades your dreams. You'll wake up at home, in clean air, and still smell the dungeon. Your brain has internalized it so completely that it generates the sensory experience even in the absence of the actual stimulus. This is what modern psychology might call a trauma response, but you just know it as the thing that makes sleep difficult and life worse. Some guards develop what we'd now recognize as obsessive-compulsive behaviors around cleanliness. They wash their hands raw, scrub themselves with rough cloths until their skin bleeds, and refuse to touch anything with their work clothes until those clothes have been boiled. Others go the opposite direction, sliding into a defeated acceptance where they stop trying to fight the contamination and just become vessels of dungeon essence. Both responses make sense as coping mechanisms. Neither actually helps. By the end of your shift, when you finally climb those stairs back into the upper castle, the contrast hits you like a physical blow. The normal castle air, which probably contains smoke from cooking fires, unwashed human bodies, animal smells from the stables, and whatever else, smells like paradise. You gulp it down, trying to flush your lungs, trying to reset your baseline. For about 30 minutes, everything smells beautiful. Then your nose adjusts and normal castle life just smells normal again. Until your next shift, when you descend back into the concentrated hell of dungeon atmosphere and remember all over again what you're enduring for your handful of coins per week. The smell doesn't just affect you, it affects how others see you. You become the dungeon guard, spoken in the same tone people use for the leper or the rat catcher. Someone whose necessary but revolting work places them outside the normal social hierarchy. Children dare each other to get close to you. Potential romantic partners vanish the moment they learn your occupation. Even other guards, the ones who work above ground on walls or gates, treat you as a different category of person, contaminated by your proximity to the castle's literal bottom. And you haven't even dealt with the darkness yet. The darkness in a medieval dungeon isn't like any darkness you've experienced before. It's not the darkness of a cloudy night where your eyes adjust and you can make out shapes. It's not the darkness of a windowless room where light bleeds under the door. This is absolute physical darkness, the kind that existed before humans invented artificial lighting, the kind that presses against your eyeballs like a tangible thing. And you're expected to work in it for most of your shift because torches cost money, and you're not worth the expense. Remember those 4 torches you were allocated? Let's do the math that your medieval brain might struggle with, but your survival instincts understand perfectly. Each torch burns for maybe 40 minutes if you're lucky, an hour tops if the person who made it actually cared about their craft. That gives you between 2.5 to 4 hours of light for a 12-hour shift. The rest of the time, 8 to 9.5 hours, you're sitting in darkness so complete that you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. You test this during your first shift, holding your palm 1 inch from your nose and seeing absolutely nothing. Your brain refuses to accept this information and keeps trying to generate visual data, creating phantom shapes and movement that aren't actually there. The torch situation gets even worse when you understand the economics. Your employer, the castle lord or his appointed dungeon master, has calculated exactly how much illumination is necessary for you to perform your minimum viable job function. That calculation apparently concluded that you need light for maybe the first hour of your shift to do initial checks, and then maybe sporadic bursts of light if something requires investigation. The rest of the time, you're expected to sit in the dark and listen. That's your job. Professional sitting in darkness and listening. It's cost-effective and utterly destroys your health in ways your employer either doesn't understand or doesn't care about. You learn quickly to ration your torches like a miser hoarding gold. You light the first one, do your initial cell checks as quickly as possible, verify chains and locks, count prisoners, note any obvious changes from the previous shift, and then extinguish it. Yes, extinguish it. Plunge yourself voluntarily into complete darkness to save the remaining burn time for later. The psychological difficulty of intentionally putting out your only light source while sitting underground surrounded by dangerous criminals cannot be overstated. Every instinct screams against it. But economic reality wins because if you burn through all 4 torches in the first 4 hours, you have 8 hours of guaranteed absolute darkness ahead. And that's somehow worse than choosing the darkness on your own terms. The extinguishing process itself is tricky. You can't just drop the torch and stomp on it because then you've wasted the remaining fuel and destroyed the torch structure. You need to carefully suffocate the flame, maybe pressing it against stone or dunking it in a bucket of water if you have one, while memorizing your exact position and orientation because the moment that light goes out, you lose all spatial reference. Guards have been found in the morning wandering confused in their own dungeon sectors, unable to locate their station, after their last torch burned out unexpectedly. The darkness doesn't just remove light, it removes your ability to construct mental maps and maintain directional awareness. Your eyes do eventually adapt to the darkness, but not in the useful way you might hope. After about 30 minutes in complete darkness, your pupils dilate fully and your rod cells, the light-sensitive cells designed for night vision, take over from your cone cells. This gives you the theoretical ability to detect extremely faint light sources. The problem is there are no faint light sources. You're underground. There's no moonlight, no starlight, no ambient city glow. At best, you might detect the faintest red glow from coals if someone left a brazier burning somewhere else in the dungeon complex, or perhaps the bioluminescence from certain fungi growing on the damp walls, which produces a ghostly greenish light so faint that you're never quite sure if you're actually seeing it or hallucinating. Historians still argue whether medieval dungeon guards experienced higher rates of vision problems compared to the general population, or whether this is assumed based on working conditions. Documentary evidence is sparse because medieval people rarely wrote about the health problems of low-status workers. However, we do have some records of dungeon guards requesting transfers due to failing eyes and references to former guards who became blind in service. Whether this blindness resulted from the darkness, the smoke from torches, infections from the unsanitary environment, or simple age-related decline remains debated. What's certain is that spending half your working life in complete darkness and the other half squinting at dim torch flames is not an evidence-based vision preservation strategy. The darkness plays tricks on your other senses. Without visual input to anchor your perception, sounds become distorted and directional awareness breaks down. You hear a prisoner cough, and you can't tell if they're in the cell 20 feet to your left or right behind you. Footsteps echo strangely, seeming to originate from multiple directions simultaneously. Water dripping creates rhythms that your brain tries to pattern match into voices or music. You hear your name called and respond, only to realize no one actually spoke. The auditory hallucinations start around hour 5 of continuous darkness and intensify from there. Your sense of touch becomes hypersensitive in the absence of vision. Every brush against your skin, a cobweb, an insect, a drop of water from the ceiling, registers as a potential threat. You feel the air currents more acutely, noticing when someone moves nearby by the displacement of air rather than by sight or sound. This heightened tactile awareness sounds useful until you realize it means you're constantly being touched by your environment in ways you can't verify. Something crawls across your foot. Is it a rat? A large insect? Your imagination filling in sensory data? You can't check without lighting a precious torch, so you just sit there, feeling things touching you, unable to confirm or deny what they are. The worst part about the darkness is what it does to your sleep cycle. Humans are diurnal creatures. We're biologically programmed to sleep when it's dark and wake when it's light. This programming runs deep, controlled by circadian rhythms that depend on light exposure to regulate hormones like melatonin and cortisol. When you sit in darkness for 12 hours during what should be your active daylight period, your brain gets catastrophically confused. It starts releasing melatonin because darkness means sleep time, right? So you become desperately drowsy during your shift, fighting to stay awake, struggling against your own biology, which is screaming that it's night and you should be unconscious. Then you climb out of the dungeon into actual daylight, exhausted from fighting sleep all shift, ready to collapse. Except now your brain sees light and thinks it's time to be awake and alert. Your cortisol spikes. You get a second wind right when you need to sleep. You lie in your bed, exhausted but unable to sleep, your body's clock completely scrambled. This pattern, fighting sleep during your work darkness, fighting wakefulness during your rest daylight, continues day after day, never allowing your circadian system to properly recalibrate. Modern shift workers who do night rotations experience similar disruption, and research shows it significantly increases risks for depression, cognitive decline, cardiovascular disease, and various cancers. You're experiencing the medieval version of this occupational hazard with zero understanding of what's happening to you or why you feel progressively worse as weeks turn into months. Some guards try to solve the torch shortage by bringing their own lighting. Candles seem like an obvious solution. They're cheaper than torches and burn longer. The problem is they produce far less light, are easily blown out by air currents, and don't travel well if you need to patrol your section. A candle gives you maybe a 5-foot radius of weak, flickering illumination that barely penetrates the dungeon's aggressive darkness. You spend more time worrying about keeping the candle lit than you do actually using the light it provides. Plus, wax candles are expensive. Most of what's available to someone of your economic status are tallow candles made from animal fat, which produce a thick, greasy smoke that adds to the air quality problems and smells like burning meat, mixing delightfully with all the other dungeon aromas. Oil lamps are another theoretical option. used extensively in Mediterranean regions and technically available in medieval Northern Europe through trade. They're more efficient than torches and provide steadier light. They're also breakable, require careful filling, need regular wick maintenance, and represent a significant upfront investment that you probably can't afford on a dungeon guard's wages. If you do manage to acquire one, you'll spend your shifts paranoid about breaking it or spilling the oil, and prisoners will spend their time trying to trick you into getting close enough to their cells that they can grab it, smash it, and plunge everyone into darkness while they attempt whatever mischief they've been planning. The psychological impact of working in near-constant darkness accumulates in ways that medieval people had no framework to understand. You start experiencing what modern psychology might call dissociative symptoms. Time becomes meaningless because you have no visual cues to mark its passage. Is it morning or evening? You genuinely can't tell. Your shift could have been 4 hours or 14 hours, and you'd have no reliable way to know. Some guards scratch marks on the wall or count stones in their mind to maintain temporal awareness. But these strategies fail when you lose count or forget what number you were on, and suddenly you're adrift in timeless darkness with no anchor to reality. Your dreams and waking life start to blur together. When you're sitting in absolute darkness, fighting sleep, your brain begins to dream while you're still technically conscious. These hypnagogic hallucinations, the vivid sensory experiences that occur in the transition between waking and sleeping, become more frequent and intense. You see things in the darkness that aren't there, not just vague shapes but detailed scenes. Prisoners who've escaped their cells, supervisors standing right in front of you demanding reports, creatures from religious nightmare imagery. You react to these visions, speaking to people who don't exist, standing up to confront threats that aren't real. The prisoners hear you and learn to exploit it, making sounds that feed into your hallucinations, creating an interactive theater of madness designed to erode your mental stability. There's a particular phenomenon that some dungeon guards report, though never in official capacity because admitting it would mean losing their position, where the darkness itself seems to become alive. Not metaphorically, but experientially real. They describe the darkness as having weight, pressing against them, breathing with its own rhythm. Modern psychology might categorize this as a panic response or sensory deprivation effect, but when you're experiencing it at 3 in the morning during your 8th hour of absolute darkness, clinical categories don't help. The darkness feels malevolent and intelligent, and you're trapped inside it for 4 more hours until your shift ends. Some castle dungeons had small light wells, narrow shafts that extended upward through the castle structure to admit a tiny amount of natural light. If you're working in one of these luxury dungeons, you might have a pale shaft of daylight that reaches down during midday hours, creating a faint gray visibility that doesn't really illuminate anything but at least confirms that the external world still exists. These light wells were typically designed for ventilation rather than illumination, and they come with their own problems. They create cold downdrafts in winter, allow rain to pour directly into the dungeon during storms, and provide an acoustic channel through which sound travels, meaning anyone in the castle above can hear screaming from below, which creates awkward social situations during dinner parties. Your night vision develops in strange ways. You become able to navigate your dungeon section in near-total darkness through memory and spatial awareness rather than sight. You count steps, memorize distances, use touch and echolocation to build mental maps. This is impressive until you realize it means you're functioning as essentially a blind person during half your waking life. The skills you develop, navigating by memory and sound, identifying locations by smell and air current, are the adaptive strategies of someone whose primary sense has been effectively removed. You're not gaining an ability. You're compensating for a disability your job has inflicted on you. The transition between darkness and light becomes physically painful. When your shift ends and you climb up into the castle proper, the normal indoor lighting, which is still fairly dim by modern standards, maybe equivalent to a few candles, hits your dark-adapted eyes like a flashbulb. You squint, tears streaming, temporarily blinded by ordinary illumination. Your pupils, which have been dilated wide for hours, constrict rapidly, causing headaches. This light sensitivity worsens over time, making the transition between your work darkness and normal life increasingly difficult. Some long-term dungeon guards develop permanent photophobia, becoming uncomfortable in normal daylight, preferring to remain in dim environments even during their off hours because bright light has become actually painful. Remember that second guard who's supposedly working your shift with you? You still haven't seen him, but you hear him occasionally moving around in the darkness, coughing, talking to prisoners in distant cells. The darkness makes even basic coordination with your colleague nearly impossible. You could light a torch to locate him, but that uses up your precious ration, and he might be in a completely different section anyway. So you both operate independently in your isolated darkness pools, occasionally calling out to each other for reassurance that you're both still alive and conscious, but otherwise functioning as solo operators in a job that really should have better communication protocols. The darkness also eliminates any possibility of reading or other mental stimulation that might make the hours pass more bearably. Even if you're one of the rare literate guards, you can't read in the dark. You can't do crafts or repairs. You can't maintain equipment. You just sit and exist in darkness, your mind slowly eating itself from boredom and sensory deprivation. Some guards develop elaborate mental practices, reciting prayers, composing songs in their heads, building imaginary structures stone by stone, anything to keep their minds occupied during the endless dark hours. These mental exercises help, but can also become obsessive and intrusive, continuing even when you don't want them to, your brain's so desperate for stimulation that it keeps running its entertainment programs even during your off hours. The darkness makes the physical dangers of your job exponentially worse. If something goes wrong, a prisoner escapes their chains, a structural collapse, a fire, a fight between prisoners, you have to respond while effectively blind. You're fumbling to light a torch with shaking hands while trying to assess a situation you can't see, and every second of delay could mean the difference between containment and catastrophe. The prisoners know this. They know you're weak in the darkness, that you can't see them coordinating signals or preparing attacks, that your response time is measured in however long it takes to get a torch lit, rather than immediate. This knowledge shifts the power dynamic in ways that keep you permanently anxious. And it's only getting worse, because you're about to learn that the human beings sharing this darkness with you are much more dangerous than the darkness itself. Your fellow guards are not the stalwart, honorable companions in arms that medieval romances might suggest. They're a collection of desperate, damaged, criminal, or outright sadistic individuals who ended up in this job because every other employment option disappeared. You're sitting in the darkness with them, trusting them to watch your back, and slowly realizing that some of them are more dangerous than the prisoners you're supposedly guarding together. The first colleague you actually meet face-to-face is a man named, let's say Robert, though his name doesn't matter as much as his missing front teeth and the way he looks at you like he's calculating whether you have anything worth stealing. Robert has been working dungeon duty for 3 years, which makes him a veteran by the standards of a job with catastrophic turnover rates. He shows you the informal systems that actually keep the dungeon functioning, which prisoners can be trusted to relay messages, which cells need to be checked more frequently because the occupant is a suicide risk, where the best place to sleep is if you absolutely can't stay awake anymore. This information is valuable, and you're grateful right up until Robert mentions that this tutorial costs you a portion of your wages, call it a mentorship fee, and if you don't pay, well, accidents happen in the darkness and no one sees anything. Welcome to your first experience with guard corruption, which isn't an occasional problem but rather the foundational economic model of dungeon employment. Your official wages are barely subsistence level, maybe a few pennies per day plus whatever scraps of food don't get consumed by the castle household. You cannot survive on this income, and everyone in the system knows it. The job is structured to require supplemental income from prisoners and their families, creating a perverse economy where you're incentivized to make conditions worse so people will pay you to make them slightly less terrible. Robert explains the standard price list. A prisoner wants an extra blanket? That's a few coins paid to you for looking the other way when their family delivers it. Better food than the standard moldy bread? That's a weekly fee. A message smuggled out to family? That's premium pricing because you're taking a real risk. Want chains that don't cut quite so deep into your wrists? Robert knows a blacksmith who'll adjust them for the right price, and you get a percentage for facilitating the transaction. The entire system runs on extortion, and you're expected to participate or you'll find yourself excluded from information sharing, getting the worst shift assignments, and mysteriously experiencing accidents that your fellow guards somehow don't notice. Some of your colleagues are former criminals themselves, sentenced to dungeon work as an alternative to imprisonment or execution. This was an actual medieval practice, offering convicted thieves, poachers, or minor offenders the option to work as dungeon guards instead of serving time. The logic being that they're already considered disreputable, they understand criminal thinking, and they're unlikely to be corrupted by prisoners since they're already operating from a position of compromised morality. What could go wrong with this system? Everything, as it turns out. Your criminal colleague guards have ongoing relationships with prisoners who are part of their old networks, facilitating communication and smuggling operations that you're completely unaware of until suddenly there's an escape or a murder and you're implicated by proximity. There's a guard on the rotation named William who was convicted of assault and given a choice between hanging and 10 years of dungeon service. William chose service, obviously, but his violent tendencies didn't disappear just because his employment category changed. He takes out his frustrations on prisoners in ways that go beyond maintaining order, beating them for entertainment, creating injuries that you then have to explain in your shift reports. You're faced with an impossible choice. Report William's behavior and become a target yourself, or stay silent and become complicit in torture that serves no institutional purpose. Most guards choose silence, and William knows it, which means his behavior escalates over time because there are no meaningful consequences. Then there's the other category of colleague, the ones who volunteered for this job because they enjoy it. These are arguably the most disturbing individuals in your workplace. They're not here because they're desperate or because they were forced. They chose dungeon work because it gives them sanctioned access to human suffering. Medieval society, for all its brutality, still recognized that there was something wrong with people who sought out opportunities to inflict pain, but it also provided institutional roles where such tendencies could be channeled in socially acceptable directions. Executioners, torturers, and dungeon guards could all attract individuals whose psychological makeup would, in a modern context, raise serious red flags about personality disorders and sadistic tendencies. You share 12-hour shifts in the darkness with a man who once told you, perfectly casually, that he loves the sound prisoners make when they first realize no one is coming to rescue them. Not a joke, not bravado, just a straightforward statement of preference delivered in the same tone someone might use to discuss their favorite meal. This man has keys to cells. He has authority over vulnerable people. He works alongside you, and you have no recourse, no HR department to report concerns to, no institutional framework for removing dangerous individuals from positions of power over prisoners. You just coexist in the darkness and hope he doesn't decide you've become interesting to him. The darkness itself enables your colleagues' worst behaviors because there's no oversight, no supervision, no witnesses to anything that happens during your shift. If a prisoner gets beaten, who's to say which guard did it? If someone's rations go missing, how do you prove who took them? If a female prisoner is sexually assaulted, and this happens with horrifying regularity in medieval dungeons, the darkness and isolation mean there's rarely evidence, rarely consequences, rarely even acknowledgement that a crime occurred. Your fellow guards know this, and some of them exploit it systematically. There's an informal hierarchy among guards that has nothing to do with official rank and everything to do with willingness to use violence. The most feared guards aren't necessarily the strongest but the most unpredictable, the ones who might turn on a fellow guard as easily as on a prisoner. You learn to read moods in the darkness, listening to breathing patterns and movement sounds, trying to assess threat levels from invisible colleagues who might be having a bad day and looking for someone to hurt. It's exhausting, maintaining this constant vigilance not just toward prisoners but toward your own supposed team. Some guards are addicted to alcohol and come to their shifts drunk or drinking throughout. Medieval ale was weak by modern standards, but consumed in sufficient quantity, it still impairs judgment and coordination. A drunk guard is unreliable for backup, likely to fall asleep during their shift, and prone to either excessive violence or complete passivity depending on their personality. You can't report them because that would violate the guard code of silence, but you also can't depend on them, which means you're effectively working solo while technically having colleagues present. The administrative assumption is that multiple guards means redundancy and safety, but in practice, it often just means multiple people failing simultaneously. Historians still argue whether medieval institutional authorities were genuinely unaware of the corruption and violence among dungeon guards, or whether they understood perfectly well but considered it an acceptable cost of the system. Some evidence suggests that castle lords and dungeon masters knew exactly what was happening but calculated that paying guards proper wages would cost more than tolerating moderate corruption. Other scholars point to periodic reform attempts and disciplinary actions as evidence that authorities tried to maintain standards. The truth probably varies by location and time period, but from your position at the bottom of the hierarchy, it's clear that whatever oversight theoretically exists is not effectively reaching down to your daily reality. The gender dynamics among guards are particularly problematic if you're a woman attempting to work in this environment, though it's worth noting that female dungeon guards were extremely rare, and when they did exist, they typically guarded female prisoners exclusively. But even as a male guard, you're witnessing how female prisoners are treated by your colleagues, and it ranges from merely dehumanizing to explicitly predatory. Guards who would never openly discuss committing sexual violence in normal social contexts will casually discuss or even plan it during shifts, the darkness and isolation apparently suspending normal moral frameworks. You're hearing this, expected to either participate in the conversation or at least not object, your silence purchased by the implicit threat of social exclusion or direct violence if you break ranks. There's a particular type of colleague who's perhaps most dangerous: the true believer. This is the guard who has convinced himself that prisoners deserve everything they suffer, that cruelty is justice, that his role is holy work punishing sinners. This psychological framework allows him to commit any atrocity without guilt because he's reframed everything as righteous action. He's not beating a starving prisoner who stole bread to feed his family. He's punishing theft, which is biblically condemned. He's not leaving someone chained in positions that cause permanent injury. He's ensuring they contemplate their sins. The true believer is immune to appeals to mercy or humanity because he's constructed an entire moral universe where mercy is weakness and suffering is deserved. These colleagues police your behavior too. If you show sympathy to prisoners, share extra food, or ease someone's chains, the true believers notice and interpret it as moral failure on your part. You're not just being kind, you're undermining the righteous punishment system, interfering with divine justice, demonstrating the weakness that got you assigned to this degrading job in the first place. The social pressure to harden yourself, to stop seeing prisoners as humans, to participate in casual cruelty as proof of your commitment to the team, is immense and unrelenting. Then there are the colleagues who are simply broken by the job. They started out maybe no worse than you, desperate for income, willing to take whatever work existed, but months or years in the dungeon have eroded their mental health to the point where they're barely functional. They talk to themselves, respond to things that aren't happening, lose track of which memories are real and which are hallucinations generated by too many hours in the darkness. They're still technically employed because guard turnover is high enough that even minimally functional bodies are valuable, but they're not reliable colleagues. They're cautionary tales, showing you your future if you stay in this job too long. You witness a veteran guard have a complete breakdown during a shift. He starts screaming about demons in the walls, attacks a prisoner who wasn't doing anything, and has to be physically restrained and dragged out of the dungeon. 2 weeks later, he's back on the rotation because apparently the castle administration's solution to a guard experiencing a psychotic episode is to give him a few days off and then put him right back into the environment that broke him. You're expected to work shifts with this man, trust him to maintain security, coordinate with him in emergencies. The absurdity would be funny if it weren't so dangerous. Communication among guards is deliberately limited by those in charge. You're not supposed to organize, form alliances, or collectively advocate for better conditions. The few times guards have tried to coordinate demands for higher pay or more tolerable working conditions, the ringleaders were fired and replaced within days. The labor market for dungeon guards is apparently fluid enough that individual workers have no leverage. You're completely replaceable and everyone knows it, which prevents any meaningful solidarity from forming even among colleagues who might otherwise support each other. The shift change process exemplifies the dysfunctional colleague relationships. When you arrive to start your shift, the guard you're relieving is supposed to brief you on any changes, problems, or relevant information from their shift. In practice, most guards want to escape the dungeon so badly that they provide minimal information, sometimes lying about issues to avoid delaying their departure. You discover problems: a prisoner who died overnight, a lock that's failing, a structural issue with a cell that should have been reported but weren't because your predecessor couldn't be bothered or actively wanted to create problems for you. There's no institutional mechanism to enforce proper handoff protocols, so information gaps accumulate into serious safety risks. Some of your colleagues supplement their income by selling information about prisoners to interested parties outside the castle. A merchant wants to know if his business rival is likely to be released or executed. That intelligence has value. A family wants updates on their imprisoned relative. That's a subscription service. A political faction wants to know what a prisoner revealed during interrogation. Premium pricing. Your colleagues are running intelligence operations from the dungeon, and you're either in on it, taking your cut, or you're excluded from information sharing and potentially framed as the source if the operation is discovered. The paranoia this creates among guards is intense. Everyone suspecting everyone else of being an informant for various competing interests. There's a particular guard named Thomas who seems friendly at first, sharing his food, asking about your family, appearing genuinely interested in your well-being. It takes you weeks to realize that Thomas is gathering information about you, your vulnerabilities, your fears, your financial situation, so he can more effectively manipulate you later. When you refuse to participate in one of his smuggling schemes, he casually mentions details about your family that he shouldn't know, the implicit threat unmistakable. You're working in darkness with a man who has demonstrated both willingness and capability to threaten your loved ones, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it except comply or risk finding out if his threats are serious. The physical proximity required by the job, sharing small spaces, sitting in darkness together, depending on each other for basic safety, creates forced intimacy with people you would cross the street to avoid in any other context. You know their breathing patterns, their digestion sounds, their sleep-talking content. They know yours. This involuntary intimacy with dangerous, unstable, or predatory individuals is another form of psychological burden the job imposes. You can never truly relax around your colleagues, never fully trust them, but you also can't escape them. They're your co-workers, your only source of social interaction during shifts, and potentially your only backup if something goes catastrophically wrong. And things are about to go wrong because while you've been worrying about your colleagues, the prisoners have been studying you both, learning your patterns, exploiting your weaknesses, and planning moves that will make you question whether the locks and chains are really keeping anyone safe. The prisoners are not passive victims waiting patiently for justice or release. They're intelligent, motivated individuals with unlimited time to observe you, plan against you, and exploit every weakness in your attention, your routines, and your psychology. You're outnumbered, working in darkness, often alone, guarding people who have absolutely nothing to lose and every reason to see you as an obstacle to survival or freedom. The power dynamic you assumed existed, armed guard over helpless prisoner, is far more complicated and precarious than you imagined. Your first lesson comes during week 2, when a prisoner named John calls you over to his cell, claiming he's sick and needs help. You approach cautiously, torch in hand, and he's performing an Oscar-worthy display of illness, clutching his stomach, groaning, looking genuinely distressed. You unlock the cell to check on him, following some residual human compassion that hasn't yet been beaten out of you by this job, and the moment you step inside, he's fine. Completely fine. He was testing you, seeing if you're the type who responds to medical complaints, how close you'll get, whether you follow protocols or act impulsively. He now has valuable intelligence about you, and you've gained nothing except the knowledge that you've been played. John smiles at you from his chains, and you realize he's been studying you like a predator studies prey since the moment you first walked past his cell. Prisoners have one resource in abundance that you don't: time. While you're juggling the immediate demands of your shift, staying awake, managing discomfort, rationing light, worrying about your colleagues, prisoners have endless hours to think, plan, and observe. They notice patterns you're not even aware you're creating. You always check the cells in the same order. You sit on your stool in a specific position. You light your second torch approximately 6 hours into your shift. You respond differently to requests depending on how tired you are. They catalog all of this information, sharing it with other prisoners through whispered conversations and coded knocks on cell walls, building a comprehensive profile of every guard's vulnerabilities. The manipulation starts small and subtle. A prisoner asks you a question about your family. Not threatening, just conversational. Where are you from? Do you have children? What's your wife's name? You answer because the loneliness and boredom of your job make any human interaction appealing. Over subsequent shifts, he asks follow-up questions, builds rapport, starts sharing information about his own family, creating the illusion of connection. Then one day he makes a request, something minor, bring him extra water or pass a message to another prisoner. You do it because you've started to see him as almost a friend, or at least as a human being rather than just a chained problem. You've now crossed a line. You've demonstrated that you can be manipulated through social engineering, and that information gets shared with every other prisoner in the dungeon. Female prisoners, in the rare instances where they're held in these facilities, develop their own manipulation strategies adapted to the gender dynamics of medieval society. They might affect helplessness, appeal to your protective instincts, or, in more calculated operations, offer sexual access in exchange for favors. A guard who accepts such an arrangement has handed over massive leverage to the prisoner. She now has the ability to accuse you of rape, a charge that could result in severe punishment even against a low-status guard, or she can simply threaten to reveal the relationship to your wife or employers. You're now working for her, essentially bringing her what she needs, following her instructions, because the alternative is destruction of your employment, your marriage, and possibly your life. The prisoners cooperate with each other in ways your guard colleagues never manage. Despite being chained separately, despite potentially being enemies on the outside, prisoners form alliances against their common enemy: you. They develop communication systems, tapping codes on pipes, whistling patterns, messages scratched into bowls that get passed during meal distribution. They coordinate strategies for wearing you down. One prisoner will call for help, pulling your attention to one end of the dungeon. While you're investigating, another prisoner is working on his chains or hiding contraband, or doing something else that requires your attention to be elsewhere. When you return, the first prisoner has a different complaint, pulling you back. They're running patterns on you like a sophisticated sports team, and you're a single defender trying to cover the entire field. There's a particular tactic that prisoners employ called the endless complaint. A prisoner begins making requests or complaints at a rate that's just sustainable enough that you can't ignore them. His chains are too tight, he needs water, there's a rat in his cell, he's cold, he's hot, the straw is wet, he needs to relieve himself. Each individual request seems reasonable, and ignoring legitimate needs could get you in trouble if he dies or is seriously injured. But fulfilling each request takes time and energy, and after the 20th interruption in 6 hours, you realize you've spent your entire shift responding to one prisoner's demands while having no capacity to properly monitor anyone else. Other prisoners have been free to do whatever they wanted because you were occupied being a concierge for one person's orchestrated neediness. Some prisoners are escape artists, and medieval restraint technology gives them plenty to work with. Chains can be picked with improvised tools, a bit of wire, a splinter of bone, anything thin and rigid enough to manipulate a simple lock mechanism. Prisoners have unlimited time to work on their chains, covering the evidence whenever you approach with your torch. By the time you notice the tampering, they might be hours away from freedom. The truly skilled ones can remove their chains, move around the dungeon during your darkness periods, and replace the chains before you check them with light. You think you're guarding secure prisoners, but you're actually supervising people who can come and go within the dungeon complex at will, choosing to remain in their cells only because they haven't yet figured out how to get past the upper doors. Historians still argue whether medieval prisoners actually achieved the sophisticated levels of coordination and manipulation that later folklore suggests, or whether these stories were exaggerated by guards to excuse their own failures. Documentary evidence includes numerous escape attempts and successful escapes that required significant planning and coordination, suggesting that at least some prisoner groups were highly organized. There are also records of guards being disciplined or executed for corruption that prisoners orchestrated through careful manipulation, indicating that the social engineering tactics were real and sometimes devastatingly effective. The prisoners quickly identify which guards are corruptible and which aren't. You might pride yourself on being incorruptible, but that just means they'll use different tactics on you. Can't be bribed? Maybe you can be intimidated. They start making threats, not obvious ones that you could report, but subtle implications about what might happen to guards who aren't flexible. A prisoner mentions your wife's name, casually noting that she shops at a particular market stall. How does he know that? He shouldn't know anything about your life outside the dungeon. But now you're aware that somehow information about you is accessible to the prisoner network, and that's a form of power over you even without explicit threats. Some prisoners are genuinely insane, driven mad by confinement or suffering from conditions that medieval people had no framework to understand or treat. These individuals are unpredictable in ways that make them particularly dangerous. A schizophrenic prisoner might hear voices telling him to attack guards, experiencing genuine delusions where you're a demon or monster that must be fought. A prisoner with severe depression might attempt suicide in ways that create hazards for you, setting fires, flooding cells, or provoking you to violence hoping you'll finish the job. You're not trained to manage mental illness. You're barely trained to manage keys and chains. Yet you're responsible for maintaining order among a population that includes people experiencing active psychotic episodes. The food distribution system provides another manipulation vector. You're responsible for delivering meals to prisoners, usually bread, watered-down ale or wine, maybe thin soup on good days. The prisoners know you handle their food, and they use this knowledge creatively. They might accuse you of poisoning them, putting you in a defensive position where you have to prove your innocence. They might refuse food and then claim starvation when supervisors check, framing you as neglectful. Or they might cultivate relationships where you feel obligated to provide extra food, slowly turning you into a smuggler without you consciously deciding to become one. There's a prisoner who's been in the dungeon for 3 years awaiting a trial that may never come. He's become a dungeon fixture, more familiar with the system than most guards, and he runs informal operations that even some of your colleagues defer to. He decides which new prisoners get protected and which get victimized, He mediates disputes between prisoners that might otherwise escalate into violence on your watch. He's essentially a prisoner administrator, and you find yourself negotiating with him to maintain order, granting him privileges in exchange for his cooperation. You've now inverted the power structure. You're asking permission from a prisoner to maintain control over your own workspace. This seems like a pragmatic accommodation until you realize he's maneuvered you into a position where removing him would destabilize the entire prisoner population, meaning your supervisors will never approve a transfer even though he's technically eligible. He's made himself irreplaceable, and he did it by manipulating you and every guard before you. Prisoners weaponize your empathy when they can identify that you have any remaining. They tell you stories, true ones probably, about being arrested for minor crimes, about families suffering without them, about the injustice of their confinement. They share details about their children, their sick parents, their pregnant wives. This information burrows into your brain during the long dark hours when you have nothing to think about except their stories. You start questioning whether the man in cell 7 really deserves to be here for poaching a rabbit. You begin making exceptions, small mercies, that accumulate into policy violations you can't walk back. The prisoners are using your humanity against you, and the alternative, completely dehumanizing them to protect yourself emotionally, turns you into exactly the kind of person you probably didn't want to become. Some prisoners are skilled at creating discord among guards. They'll tell you that your colleague Robert has been accepting bribes from certain prisoners but not others. They'll mention that William has been beating prisoners outside his assigned section, creating liability for you if it's discovered. They plant seeds of suspicion and mistrust, fragmenting the already weak cooperation among your guard team. The genius of this strategy is that some of what they're telling you is probably true. Your colleagues are corrupt and violent, so you can't simply dismiss it as manipulation. You're left trying to parse truth from lies using information from fundamentally untrustworthy sources, a cognitive task that's impossible to complete accurately. The darkness is the prisoner's greatest ally. They know you can't see them most of the time. They know you're rationing light. They use the darkness to move within whatever range their chains allow, to signal each other, to hide evidence of planning or rule violations. When you do light a torch, they've had time to prepare, arranging themselves in innocent positions, hiding anything incriminating, presenting exactly the scene they want you to see. You're conducting inspections where the subjects have advanced warning and staging capability, making your security checks essentially theatrical performances rather than genuine assessments. There's a type of prisoner who's particularly unsettling. The one who seems completely calm and content despite being in arguably the worst situation a human can occupy. This person isn't agitating for release, isn't complaining, isn't trying to manipulate you in obvious ways. They just exist peacefully in their chains, day after day, which doesn't make sense unless they know something you don't. Are they confident of imminent release? Have they already escaped mentally, retreating into internal worlds where their physical confinement is irrelevant? Or, the most disturbing possibility, are they waiting for something specific, patiently preparing for a moment that will come as a complete surprise to you? Prisoners test boundaries constantly, like children probing parental rules to find inconsistencies. They make requests that are technically against protocols but seem harmless. They violate minor rules to see if you enforce them. They create small provocations to measure your response. Every interaction is a data-gathering exercise, building profiles of your enforcement patterns, your tolerance for rule-breaking, your response to different types of challenges. Over time, they develop sophisticated models of your behavior that let them predict your actions better than you can predict theirs. The verbal abuse is constant and creative. Prisoners have unlimited time to devise insults, threats, and psychological attacks designed to wear you down. They comment on your appearance, your smell, your obvious poverty, and low status. They speculate loudly about your sexual inadequacies, your family's shame at your occupation, your inevitable future. Some of this is just venting frustration, but some is calculated to provoke you into responses that violate protocols, giving them legitimate complaints against you. You're being baited constantly, forced to maintain composure while being told in graphic detail exactly what the speaker would do to you if the chains were removed. And sometimes, rarely but memorably, a prisoner just tells you the truth. They look at you with something like pity and say that you're in a worse prison than they are, that at least they know their situation is temporary or that they're awaiting trial or execution, which gives them something to orient toward. But you're choosing to return to this hell every day for wages that barely feed you, destroying your health and sanity, becoming exactly as trapped as the prisoners but without even the excuse of being forced. These moments of clarity from prisoners cut deeper than any insult because they're absolutely correct, and you know it. But you can't think about that too long because the rats are gathering, and there's something moving in the straw, and you're pretty sure you're starting to develop the same cough you've been hearing from cell 12. The rats arrive around hour 3 of your first shift, and they never really leave. Not metaphorically, literally. There are rats present in your workspace at all times, moving through the shadows, investigating the straw, checking you for signs of weakness. Medieval dungeon rats are a different species of problem than the occasional rodent you might encounter in a barn or kitchen. These are specialized organisms that have adapted to an environment of perpetual darkness, unlimited human waste, and the constant availability of organic matter, and they're no longer particularly afraid of humans. The first one you see clearly is enormous, easily the size of a small rabbit, with fur that's matted and wet from dungeon moisture. It sits about 10 feet from your stool, well within your torch's light radius, and just watches you. Not nervously, not preparing to flee, just watching with dark eyes that reflect your torchlight like tiny mirrors. You make a noise trying to scare it away, and it doesn't move. You throw a pebble in its direction, and it casually sidesteps and returns to watching. The rat has assessed you and determined you're not a threat. This is its territory, and you're the interloper who will eventually leave while it remains forever. The dungeon rat population exists in numbers you cannot comprehend until you sit in the darkness and listen. When your torch is out and you're waiting in absolute blackness, you hear them moving constantly. Claws scratching stone, bodies brushing against walls, squeaks and chittering that sound almost like conversation. You estimate maybe a dozen rats based on the sounds. Then you light a torch and watch them scatter, and you count easily 50 visible rats retreating into cracks and shadows. And those are just the ones you can see. The actual population is probably 10 times that number, creating a parallel society of rodents that coexists with the human dungeon occupants. These rats feed on everything. Prisoner waste, certainly. They're efficient organic waste processors, which is the closest thing to a sanitation system the dungeon has. Food scraps, obviously. Dead insects. Chunks of straw mixed with whatever else. And meat when available. If a prisoner dies and isn't removed quickly, the rats begin feeding within hours. You'll discover this the hard way during a shift when you finally investigate why the prisoner in cell 9 hasn't responded to your calls, and you find him dead, already partially consumed by rats that have been working on him since sometime during the previous shift. The smell, already overwhelming in the dungeon, reaches new dimensions when you encounter decomposing human flesh that rodents have been gnawing. But the rats don't wait for death. They bite living prisoners too, particularly those who are chained in positions that prevent defensive movement or who are too weak to fight back. You'll see prisoners with fresh rat bites on their feet, hands, faces. Anywhere exposed flesh was accessible while they slept or lost consciousness. These bites often become infected in the unsanitary dungeon conditions, leading to fevers, abscesses, and occasionally systemic infections that kill otherwise healthy people through sepsis. You're powerless to prevent this. You can't eliminate the rats. They breed faster than you could possibly kill them, and they have escape routes throughout the dungeon structure. You can only document the bites and watch prisoners slowly succumb to complications. The rats carry diseases, though medieval people don't understand germ theory or epidemiology well enough to make the direct connection. What you do observe is that sickness spreads through the dungeon in waves, often following periods of heavy rat activity. Prisoners develop fevers, swollen lymph nodes, and strange rashes. Some recover. Many don't. You're exposed to the same rats, breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces they've contaminated with their waste and the pathogens they carry. The plague, both bubonic and pneumonic varieties, finds ideal conditions in medieval dungeons. Dense populations, poor hygiene, abundant rat vectors, and no concept of quarantine protocols. Historians still argue whether rats were the primary plague vector or whether human fleas and person-to-person transmission played larger roles in medieval epidemics. Recent research suggests the story is more complex than rats caused the Black Death, pointing to human ectoparasites and pneumonic transmission as possibly more significant factors. However, rats definitely contributed to the general disease burden in confined spaces like dungeons, carrying not just Yersinia pestis but also hantaviruses, leptospirosis, rat bite fever, and various parasitic infections that could devastate immunocompromised prisoner populations. The rats compete with you for food. When you bring your meal for the shift, usually bread, maybe cheese if you're fortunate, you have to defend it actively from rat theft. They're bold enough to approach while you're eating, quick enough to snatch food if you're not vigilant, and smart enough to work in teams where one creates a distraction while another grabs the prize. You learn to eat quickly, paranoid and joyless, cramming food into your mouth while constantly scanning for approaching rodents. Sometimes you lose. A rat runs off with half your dinner, and now you're facing 8 more hours of physical duty while underfed. You're already insufficient calories stolen by a creature that probably eats better than you do. But rats are just the beginning of the dungeon's wildlife ecosystem. The lice arrive on your second day, transferred from prisoners during your cell checks or simply present in the ambient environment waiting for warm-blooded hosts. Medieval people are familiar with lice. They're a common affliction across all social classes, but dungeon lice seem especially vigorous, breeding in the perfect conditions of constant warmth, darkness, and host availability. They infest your hair, your clothing, your bedding at home. The itching becomes constant background noise in your consciousness, occasionally flaring into acute misery that makes you scratch until you bleed. Lice carry typhus, though again, medieval medicine doesn't understand the vector. What you observe is that guards and prisoners develop terrible fevers, confusion, and dark spots on their skin. The disease spreads through the dungeon population with ruthless efficiency because everyone is hosting lice and everyone is in close contact. Typhus kills maybe 10 to 40% of those infected, depending on the strain and the victim's baseline health. You're watching a lottery play out where every day you don't develop symptoms is just another day of borrowed time. Some guards last years before typhus finds them. Others catch it within weeks of starting employment. The randomness adds another layer of anxiety to your job. You can't control this risk, can't prevent it through any behavior modification, can only exist in the environment and hope your immune system performs a miracle. The fleas are another delight. They live in the straw, in the clothing, on the rats, on the prisoners, and now on you. Flea bites itch differently than lice. Sharper, more localized, creating small red welts that cluster around your ankles and waist where clothing creates dark, warm spaces. Medieval people try various remedies, aromatic herbs, specific types of soap, religious medallions blessed against pests, with predictably limited effectiveness against parasites that have no respect for either herbal medicine or divine intervention. The fleas, like the lice, are potential plague vectors, hopping from infected rats to humans and back, creating transmission networks that turn the dungeon into an incubator for epidemic disease. Then there are the bedbugs, which somehow thrive even in an environment that seems too harsh for anything to prosper. They hide in the cracks of wooden structures, your stool, the door frames, the rare wooden planks in the ceiling, emerging at night to feed on you while you struggle to stay awake. Bedbug bites are maddening, creating intensely itchy welts that last for days. The psychological impact of being fed upon by insects while you work is profound and demoralizing. You're not just employed in the dungeon, you're part of the dungeon food chain, a resource that parasites harvest as casually as you might pick an apple. Larger insects appear depending on season and location. Cockroaches the size of your thumb, moving with horrible confidence across the walls. Spiders of various species, some venomous, building webs in corners that accumulate dead insects and create gothic drapery that catches your torchlight in unsettling ways. Centipedes that move too fast to track, appearing suddenly on the wall near your face and then vanishing before you can react. The dungeon is ecologically rich in the worst possible way, hosting a thriving community of creatures that consider your misery irrelevant to their reproductive success. The flies are seasonal, but when they arrive in clouds. Summer brings flies that breed in the waste, the decomposing straw, any organic matter they can access. They land on your food, your face, your open mouth if you're not vigilant. They carry bacteria from the waste to your meals, from infected wounds to your scratches, cross-contaminating everything in an environment that already has no meaningful concept of hygiene. Medieval people understand that flies are associated with filth and disease, often citing them in descriptions of hell and punishment, but understanding the association doesn't provide tools to prevent it. The flies do what flies do, and you endure it. Some prisoners develop serious parasitic infections, intestinal worms being the most common. Tapeworms, roundworms, and other helminth species thrive in the conditions of poor sanitation and contaminated water that define dungeon life. You'll see prisoners passing worms in their waste, sometimes alive and writhing, sometimes in quantities that seem impossible to have been hosted by a single human body. These infections cause malnutrition, anemia, abdominal pain, and general decline. Prisoners with heavy worm burdens become progressively weaker, their bodies literally being consumed from inside by parasites that compete for every calorie they manage to ingest. You're not immune to these parasitic infections. You're eating in the dungeon, drinking water that's been stored in containers that rats and insects access freely, breathing air full of fecal particles, touching your face with hands that have contacted contaminated surfaces. Intestinal parasites will eventually find you, and you'll experience the distinctive misery of knowing you're hosting organisms that are eating your food, damaging your intestinal lining, and potentially causing long-term health complications. Medieval treatments for worms, various herbs, fasting regimens, prayer have mixed effectiveness at best. Some remedies might actually work through lucky pharmacological accidents. Most don't. The dungeon's ecosystem also includes various fungi and molds that grow on the damp walls, the wet straw, any surface that stays moist long enough. Some of these produce bioluminescence, that faint ghostly green glow you sometimes think you see in absolute darkness. It's beautiful and eerie, and also a sign that you're breathing in fungal spores with every breath. Molds produce mycotoxins that can cause respiratory problems, neurological symptoms, and immune system suppression. Long-term exposure to toxic molds, which is exactly what dungeon employment entails, correlates with chronic health problems that medieval medicine has no framework to diagnose or treat. The moisture itself hosts bacteria that cause various infections. The constant damp on your skin creates perfect conditions for fungal skin infections, athlete's foot, ringworm, various mycoses that create itchy, spreading rashes that won't heal as long as you keep working in the wet environment. The skin between your toes becomes white and cracked. Your feet develop permanent odor problems that no amount of washing can eliminate. Bacterial skin infections from scratching your insect bites become routine, requiring no particular injury to develop. Just existing in the dungeon is enough for your skin's defenses to eventually be overwhelmed by the sheer microbial load of the environment. You develop what would now be recognized as a chronic respiratory infection. The cough you noticed on day 1 becomes permanent. You're producing sputum constantly, your lungs trying to expel the accumulated fungal spores, dust, and bacterial load. Sometimes the sputum is clear. Sometimes it's yellow or green, indicating active infection. Occasionally it contains blood, which is terrifying but becomes almost routine after a while. Your breathing is never easy or clear. You're perpetually congested, perpetually coughing, perpetually aware that your lungs are being damaged by your job in ways that will shorten your life significantly. The prisoners suffer worse, obviously. They're in the environment 24 hours a day while you at least get to leave for part of each day. You watch them decline from disease and malnutrition and infection, their bodies slowly failing under the combined assault of incarceration, parasites, and pathogens. Some develop tuberculosis, the distinctive cough and bloody sputum unmistakable once you've learned to recognize them. TB spreads person to person through the air, which means the enclosed dungeon spaces with poor ventilation are ideal transmission environments. Prisoners cough, the bacteria become airborne, you breathe them in, and now you're potentially incubating tuberculosis that might take years to become symptomatic but will eventually kill you through progressive lung destruction. The water situation magnifies all the disease risks. The dungeon's water supply, whatever it is, wherever it comes from, is certainly contaminated. There's no filtration, no boiling, no treatment of any kind. Water stored in the dungeon picks up bacteria, algae, insect larvae, and whatever the rats deposit. Prisoners and guards alike drink this water because the alternative is dying of thirst. You develop frequent diarrhea, cramping, and general gastrointestinal distress that becomes your normal state. Waterborne diseases, cholera, dysentery, various other bacterial and parasitic infections cycle through the dungeon population regularly, and you're just hoping each time that this outbreak will be one you survive. Your immune system is under constant assault from multiple vectors simultaneously. You're chronically stressed, poorly nourished, sleep-deprived, and exposed to more pathogens than any immune system evolved to handle. The result is that you're perpetually slightly sick, low-grade fever, fatigue, malaise, punctuated by acute illnesses that lay you flat for days at a time. Medieval people don't understand how immunity works, but they observe empirically that dungeon workers get sick frequently and die young. The job's life expectancy is terrible, measurably worse than other medieval occupations, and disease accounts for more guard deaths than violence or accidents combined. And speaking of violence and accidents, you're starting to realize that even if the diseases don't kill you quickly, the psychological toll of this work is doing something to your mind that might be even worse than physical illness. The screaming starts around hour 7 of your first shift, and after that, it never entirely stops. Not metaphorical screaming. Actual human voices producing sounds of such profound distress that your nervous system responds with adrenaline and panic even though you understand intellectually that the screaming is expected, normal, part of the environment. A prisoner is being interrogated somewhere else in the dungeon complex. The stone walls carry sound in unpredictable ways, so you can't tell exactly where it's coming from or how far away it is. The screaming just exists in your auditory space, layered over the dripping water and rat sounds, becoming part of the dungeon's ambient soundtrack. Interrogation in medieval dungeons often involves torture. This isn't a secret or a scandal. It's accepted judicial practice. Courts of the period recognized testimony extracted under torture as legitimate evidence, operating under the theory that pain compels truth-telling. The methods vary by region and era, but common approaches include the strappado, suspending someone by their arms tied behind their back, the rack, stretching the body to dislocate joints, crushing devices for thumbs or feet, and various applications of fire or heated implements. You're not directly participating in these interrogations. That's specialized work performed by trained torturers who earn higher wages than you. But you're close enough that the sounds reach you clearly. The psychological impact of hearing torture cannot be overstated. Your brain is wired to respond to distress vocalizations from other humans as emergency situations requiring intervention. Hearing someone scream in pain triggers fight or flight responses. Elevated heart rate, rapid breathing, muscle tension, heightened alertness. These responses make sense if you're in a position to help or flee. But you can do neither. You must sit on your stool, maintain your post, and simply endure hearing another human being tortured. Your body keeps generating crisis-level stress responses to sounds you're not allowed to respond to, creating a physiological contradiction that accumulates as trauma over time. The screams vary. Sometimes they're wordless expressions of pure pain, high-pitched, animal sounds that barely seem human. Sometimes they're articulate pleading, begging for mercy, praying to God or saints, promising confession or information or anything to make it stop. Sometimes they're defiant, cursing interrogators, maintaining innocence, refusing to submit even as the torture continues. Each type affects you differently, creating an emotional catalog of human suffering that plays on loop in your memory during the long dark hours when you have nothing to do but think. Between torture sessions, you hear the aftermath. Prisoners who've been interrogated return to their cells broken in various ways. Physically damaged with dislocated joints, burns, or crushed extremities, and psychologically shattered, sobbing quietly or staring into nothing with expressions that suggest they've gone somewhere else mentally and may not return. You're responsible for monitoring these prisoners, ensuring they don't die immediately from their injuries, providing whatever minimal care the system allocates, usually none. You watch them suffer the consequences of interrogation, unable to provide meaningful medical treatment, unable to offer comfort without risking accusations of sympathizing with criminals. Some prisoners don't return from interrogation. You do a count and come up one short, and eventually someone mentions casually that the prisoner died during questioning, and you should update your records accordingly. These deaths are not necessarily intentional. Torture is an imprecise tool that sometimes goes too far, but they're not exactly accidental either. Everyone involved understands that death is a possible outcome, and the system continues regardless. You're processing the administrative aftermath of someone being tortured to death, filling out logs, adjusting your prisoner count, and then returning to your stool to sit in the darkness for another several hours. The darkness amplifies everything. When torture happens during your torchlit periods, you can at least orient the experience. There's a visual context, a sense of the physical world continuing normally in some ways despite the horror. But when torture happens while you're sitting in absolute darkness, the screams become disembodied, sourceless, almost supernatural. Your brain struggles to process them without visual confirmation of their reality. The sounds seem to come from everywhere and nowhere, from inside the walls or inside your own head. Prisoners learn to exploit this, making their own sounds that mimic torture screams, keeping you in a constant state of uncertainty about what's real and what's manipulation. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely less disturbed by violence and suffering compared to modern populations, or whether this supposed tolerance is a myth. Evidence suggests medieval people actually had complex emotional responses to violence, with religious and philosophical frameworks for processing it that differed from but weren't necessarily shallower than modern psychological approaches. What's clear is that continuous exposure to torture sounds would have been traumatic in any historical context, and dungeon guards developed various coping mechanisms: emotional numbing, dark humor, religious rationalization, alcohol abuse, that suggest they were indeed deeply affected by their working conditions. The interrogation schedule is irregular, which prevents you from preparing psychologically. Sometimes days pass with no torture sessions. Sometimes there are multiple per shift. Sometimes they happen at the beginning of your shift when you're relatively fresh, sometimes at the end when you're already exhausted and vulnerable. The unpredictability keeps your stress response system activated constantly. You're always anticipating the next scream, always tensed for it, never able to fully relax. This chronic hypervigilance is exhausting and contributes to the sleep problems and anxiety that define dungeon guard psychology. Your fellow guards have different reactions to the torture sounds. Some seem genuinely unbothered, eating their meals while screams echo through the stone corridors, making jokes about the interrogation in progress. You can't tell if they're actually unaffected or if they're performing indifference as a coping mechanism or social survival strategy. Others are visibly disturbed but silent about it, understanding that admitting emotional difficulty with the job's requirements marks you as weak or unsuitable. A few explicitly enjoy it, gravitating toward the interrogation areas when they're not required to be at their posts, watching through doorways, offering unsolicited suggestions to the torturers. These are the colleagues who disturb you most, not because they're witnessing torture, but because they seem to find entertainment in it. You also have to manage the prisoners who hear the torture. They're terrified, understanding that what's happening to someone else today could happen to them tomorrow. Their fear manifests in various ways. Some become desperately compliant, trying to demonstrate they're no threat and need not be questioned. Others become hostile and agitated, acting out in ways that actually increase their likelihood of being selected for interrogation. Some withdraw entirely, becoming catatonic, checking out psychologically to avoid processing the reality of their situation. You're supposed to maintain order among a prisoner population that's being systematically terrorized by the judicial system, using no tools except your presence and whatever authority prisoners still believe you possess. The children are the worst. Yes, there are sometimes children in medieval dungeons, either imprisoned with parents, held for minor crimes, or detained as hostages in political situations. When a child screams under torture, which happens, medieval justice not particularly squeamish about applying interrogation techniques regardless of age. The sound is qualitatively different from adult suffering. Higher pitched, more genuinely confused, carrying an innocence that makes it psychologically devastating even for guards who've become relatively numb to adult torture sounds. You'll hear a child being tortured once, during a shift when you're already exhausted and vulnerable, and that sound will haunt you for the rest of your life, surfacing in dreams and quiet moments, a permanent psychic wound that never fully heals. The isolation magnifies the psychological impact of everything you experience. You can't discuss what you're hearing with people outside the dungeon system because they don't want to know and you don't want to explain. Describing the sounds of torture to your family over dinner isn't socially appropriate or psychologically possible. You can't even really discuss it with fellow guards because there's an implicit understanding that you don't talk about the hardest parts of the job. Doing so might force everyone to acknowledge the horror of what you're participating in, breaking the fragile psychological defenses that allow any of you to continue working. So you sit alone with your experiences, processing trauma without social support or psychological framework, gradually developing what modern medicine might recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but medieval people just call being troubled or melancholic. You startle easily at loud noises. You have intrusive memories of the worst things you've heard or seen. You experience emotional numbing where you can't feel joy or connection even in situations that should be pleasant. You avoid situations or conversations that remind you of the dungeon. You're hypervigilant, always scanning for threats, unable to relax even in safe environments. All the classic PTSD symptoms, but you live in a century that won't medicalize or even really acknowledge psychological trauma for another 600 years. The darkness interacts with the torture sounds in particularly insidious ways. When you're sitting in pitch blackness and hear screaming, your imagination fills in the visual details. What you imagine is often worse than what's actually happening. Your brain generates horrific imagery to match the sounds, creating personalized nightmares calibrated to your specific fears and sensitivities. These imagined scenes become memories that are neurologically almost identical to actual witnessed events. You remember seeing things you never actually saw, your brain writing false visual memories to accompany the genuine auditory ones. expanding your trauma catalog beyond even what you directly experienced. Some prisoners attempt suicide, and you're responsible for preventing this despite understanding completely why they'd prefer death to continued imprisonment. You find prisoners who've tried to hang themselves with whatever materials they could improvise. Torn clothing, straw twisted into rope, chains manipulated into nooses. You're required to cut them down, revive them if possible, and return them to the conditions that drove them to attempt suicide in the first place. The futility is crushing. You're saving lives only to preserve suffering, maintaining human existence for no apparent purpose beyond satisfying administrative requirements that someone remain alive for trial or execution. Some prisoners thank you for the intervention. Others curse you, and you understand both responses equally well. The sensory overload of the dungeon environment, the smells, the sounds, the darkness, the vermin, the disease, creates a state of continuous mild traumatization that prevents psychological recovery. Even if you have a few relatively calm shifts, your nervous system never fully resets because the baseline conditions remain overwhelming. It's like trying to heal from injuries while continuously sustaining new ones. The body never gets the recovery period needed to repair damage, so problems accumulate and compound over time. Your mental health deteriorates not through any single catastrophic event, but through the grinding attrition of daily exposure to intolerable conditions. The religious framework that medieval people used to process suffering provides some comfort, but also creates new problems. You might interpret your work as spiritually meaningful, guarding sinners, maintaining justice, serving your Lord who serves the social order ordained by God. This narrative can help you feel that your suffering has purpose and meaning, but it can also trap you, making leaving the job feel like abandoning a holy duty, turning occupational misery into a religious obligation. And when you witness suffering that seems disproportionate to crimes, children tortured, innocent people destroyed by false accusations, punishments that vastly exceed offenses, the religious framework starts to fracture, creating faith crises on top of your other psychological burdens. You develop what modern therapists might call dissociation, a mental separation where part of you is present in the dungeon performing duties while another part of you observes from a distance, numb and disconnected. This splitting allows you to function despite the horror of your environment, but it also means you're never fully present in your life. Even at home with your family, part of you remains in the dungeon, unable to fully engage or feel present in moments of normal life. Your wife notices you're distant. Your children find you frightening or sad. You're physically present but psychologically absent, lost in internal spaces where you're processing trauma that has no acceptable outlet. The nightmares, when they start, never really stop. You dream of being the prisoner instead of the guard, experiencing torture from the victim's perspective with hallucinatory vividness. You dream of prisoners escaping and attacking you, fulfilling the fears you suppress during waking hours. You dream of darkness that's alive and malevolent, smothering you, pulling you down into depths you can't escape. You wake from these dreams already exhausted, dreading the return to the actual dungeon that inspired them, caught in a cycle where your sleeping and waking lives are both dominated by the same traumatic content. Some guards break completely, developing what medieval people might call madness, but what modern diagnosis would recognize as severe mental illness triggered or exacerbated by occupational trauma. They start talking to people who aren't there, responding to hallucinated voices, becoming unable to distinguish dungeon experiences from imagination or memory. The administrative response to a guard going mad is typically just to replace them. There's no treatment, no support, no pension for psychological disability. You're simply discarded when you stop being functional, left to survive however you can with a broken mind and no resources. And through all of this psychological torture, you still have to perform your actual job duties, maintain alertness, make decisions, interact with dangerous prisoners and colleagues, all while your mental health is actively deteriorating from the very environment you're required to remain present in. It's an impossible situation and everyone in the system knows it, but the dungeon needs guards and you need income, so the arrangement continues until you break or quit or die. You're starting to realize that dungeon guard isn't really a job. It's a process of systematic human destruction that happens to provide minimal wages while it grinds you down. The career trajectory of a dungeon guard is less a ladder and more a pit. You start at the bottom and gradually sink deeper into a hole that offers no upward mobility, no skills transferable to better employment, and no dignified exit strategy. Around month 3 of your employment, once the initial survival panic has subsided and you've adapted enough to function in the horror, you start looking around for advancement opportunities and slowly realize there aren't any. This is it. This is the job in its entirety, and it will remain exactly this terrible for as long as you continue doing it. The organizational structure above you is remarkably flat. There's you, the basic dungeon guard, earning your handful of pennies per shift. Above you is maybe a senior guard who's survived long enough to earn a title but not significantly more money. He makes perhaps 20% more than you for the privilege of dealing with administrative headaches and being blamed when things go wrong. Above him is the dungeon master or keeper, who's typically a minor castle official with multiple responsibilities beyond just the dungeon. He's not climbing any ladders either. This is a permanent middle management position that no one particularly respects. Above him is the castle constable or lord, who regards the dungeon as a necessary infrastructure component like the stables or granary, requiring minimal investment and generating minimal interest. There is no path from dungeon guard to any position of actual status or comfort. You will not become a castle constable through excellent dungeon guarding. You will not earn a land grant or knighthood or even a promotion to regular castle guard on the walls or gates. Those positions require connections, family status, or skills you don't have and can't develop while working underground surrounded by human misery. The dungeon is a dead end in the most literal sense. People enter this job and either leave it for something else entirely or stay until they're physically or mentally incapable of continuing. Your wages never meaningfully increase. Medieval economies don't generally feature systematic raises or salary progression based on tenure. You might negotiate slightly better pay if you become genuinely irreplaceable through specialized knowledge of the facility, but irreplaceable dungeon guard is not a position of leverage. There are always desperate people willing to take the job, and your employer knows it. The economic desperation that brought you here in the first place persists and intensifies as the job damages your health, reducing your options for alternative employment while your earning power remains essentially static. The skills you're developing, if that's even the right word, are worse than useless for other employment. What are you learning? How to sit in darkness for extended periods. How to tolerate overwhelming sensory assault. How to manage criminals with minimal resources. These aren't marketable competencies outside the punishment and incarceration sector, and there aren't many positions in that sector to begin with. You're not learning literacy, arithmetic, trade skills, agricultural knowledge, or any of the practical abilities that might open doors elsewhere. You're learning to endure, which is valuable for survival but doesn't translate into employment opportunities. The job actively destroys your health in ways that reduce your future employability. The chronic respiratory infections, the damaged vision, the psychological trauma, the parasitic infections, all of these accumulate into a disability portfolio that makes you less attractive for physical labor positions that might otherwise be available. Potential employers see a man who coughs constantly, startles at loud noises, smells permanently of dungeon miasma, and looks significantly older than his actual age. They choose someone else. Your dungeon employment is burning through your lifetime physical and mental capital without building anything to replace it. The social stigma attached to dungeon work follows you permanently. Even if you quit tomorrow and find something else, everyone in your community knows you worked in the dungeon. You're the former dungeon guard, which carries implications of moral compromise, exposure to evil, and general uncleanliness that never fully wash away. Parents discourage their daughters from courting you. Guild masters are reluctant to accept you as an apprentice. Parish priests view you with suspicion, wondering what working in Hell's anteroom has done to your soul. The social damage from dungeon employment persists long after the physical employment ends. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely viewed dungeon guards with the degree of contempt that literary and legal sources suggest, or whether this contempt was exaggerated by elites writing from positions of privilege. Some evidence indicates that communities differentiated between guards who performed their duties humanely versus those who were cruel, suggesting more nuanced social judgment than simple categorical stigma. However, other sources group dungeon guards with executioners, torturers, and prostitutes as practitioners of dishonorable professions subject to legal and social disabilities, regardless of individual conduct. The reality probably varied by location and period, but nowhere was dungeon guard considered respectable or honorable work. The lack of retirement provisions means you work until you can't anymore, and then you're done. There's no pension, no retirement fund, no social safety net beyond whatever family or charity might provide. Guards who become too sick, too injured, or too mad to continue working are simply terminated and left to survive however they can. You've seen the former guards around town. The ones who made it out alive but broken, begging for alms, sleeping rough, displaying the visible scars of their service while society steps around them with distaste and indifference. That's your future unless you die in service or manage to escape to something else before the job completes its destruction of you. Some guards try to leverage their position for networking opportunities, cultivating relationships with prisoners from influential families or political factions, hoping that a grateful released prisoner might remember the guard who treated him decently and offer employment or patronage later. This strategy occasionally works. There are documented cases of prisoners rewarding guards who help them, but it requires significant risk. You're gambling that the prisoner survives and is released, that they remember you positively, that they have actual power and resources after release, and that they're willing to associate publicly with a former dungeon guard. Most of these gambles fail. The prisoner dies or is executed or is released but powerless, or simply doesn't care about the guard who was slightly less terrible than he might have been. The alternative strategy is the criminal one. Maximize your income from corruption while employed, save aggressively, and hope to accumulate enough capital to establish yourself in a small trade or business after leaving dungeon work. Some guards pursue this successfully, operating extensive smuggling and extortion operations that generate significant illicit income. The problems are obvious. The corruption increases your risk of being caught and punished, potentially landing you on the prisoner side of the bars, and it requires you to become exactly the kind of person you probably didn't want to be when you started this job. You're choosing between poverty with moral integrity and financial security through systematic exploitation of suffering people. The job has engineered a situation where these feel like your only options. The physical damage accumulates until you reach a breaking point. Maybe it's the tuberculosis that finally takes you down. You develop the full symptomatic disease, start coughing blood regularly, lose weight precipitously, and become too weak to work. Maybe it's a joint injury from a fall in the darkness that heals poorly and leaves you unable to navigate the stairs or manage the physical demands of the position. Maybe it's blindness from years of alternating between darkness and harsh torchlight, infections, and probably some degree of nutritional deficiency affecting your vision. Whatever the specific mechanism, your body eventually refuses to continue, and you're done whether you're ready or not. The psychological breaking point comes for almost everyone eventually. One shift, something happens. A particularly disturbing torture session, a prisoner who reminds you too much of yourself, a moment where the full weight of what you're participating in crashes through your defenses, and you simply can't return the next day. You wake up for your shift and physically cannot make yourself walk toward the castle. Your body refuses. Some guards never work again after this moment, the psychological damage too severe to allow them back into the environment that broke them. Others take a few days, force themselves to return, and push through until the next breaking point, gradually depleting their psychological reserves until nothing remains. Your employer has no investment in your long-term well-being. You're a replaceable component in the dungeon system, valuable only as long as you're functional, discardable the moment you're not. The economic calculation is clear. It's cheaper to burn through guards and replace them than to improve working conditions, provide adequate wages, or develop retention programs. The steady supply of desperate people ensures that guard recruitment is never difficult enough to force systemic improvements. You're competing against your own desperation. Every person willing to take this terrible job enables the continuation of the conditions that make it terrible. Some guards do find exit paths, usually through connections developed outside the dungeon context. A guard whose brother is a merchant might eventually get hired to help with that business. A guard who maintained ties with his original craft guild might be readmitted to apprenticeship despite the years of dungeon work. A guard who married into a family with resources might be supported in leaving for something better. But these exits require external resources that most guards don't have. Remember, you took this job because you were desperate and isolated, circumstances that haven't improved through dungeon employment. The people who successfully escape are typically those who had advantages to begin with and took dungeon work as a temporary expedient rather than a last resort. The long-term survivors, guards who somehow last 5, 10, or even 20 years in the position, are universally damaged in observable ways. They're physically ruined, psychologically hardened or broken, socially isolated, and often morally compromised by years of participating in a system that routinely destroys human beings. They're not success stories to emulate. They're warnings about what staying too long will do to you. When you look at a 20-year veteran guard, you're not seeing career achievement. You're seeing someone who either had no better options or who became so adapted to dungeon life that normal existence became impossible for them. The job offers no glory, no honor, no recognition for service. There are no ceremonies celebrating your years of dungeon guarding, no medals for valor in the darkness, no public acknowledgement of the difficulty of your work. Society needs dungeons to function, needs guards to staff them, but doesn't want to think about either. You're performing a necessary service while being treated as essentially disposable, experiencing the cognitive dissonance of being simultaneously essential and worthless. The lack of social recognition or validation contributes to the psychological damage. You can't even tell yourself that your suffering serves a respected purpose, because society's message is clear. What you do is necessary but contemptible. The family impact extends your career limitations to your household. Your children inherit some of your social stigma, facing discrimination and limited opportunities because of your employment. Your spouse experiences social isolation, other community members reluctant to associate closely with the dungeon guard's family. Your household income remains perpetually inadequate, creating multi-generational poverty that your employment was supposed to alleviate but instead perpetuates. You took this job hoping to provide for your family, and instead you're damaging their prospects along with your own. Some guards develop substance dependencies, alcohol most commonly, as coping mechanisms for the psychological burden of the work. This creates a tragic feedback loop. The job drives you to drink, the drinking makes you less employable elsewhere, the unemployability traps you in the job that's driving the drinking. Medieval society has limited frameworks for treating addiction, mostly religious approaches emphasizing willpower and moral reform, which have predictably poor success rates for dependencies rooted in occupational trauma. You're stuck in a biochemical trap with no effective exit strategy. The awareness that you're in a career dead end with no good options creates its own psychological burden. You're not just suffering the immediate miseries of the job, you're suffering the knowledge that this suffering has no productive purpose, isn't building toward anything better, and will simply continue until you break. The existential despair of a truly hopeless situation adds weight to every shift, every descent into darkness, every hour spent sitting on your damp stool contemplating a future that offers no improvement no matter what choices you make. And yet you return tomorrow, because the alternatives are starvation, crime, or some other form of desperation that seems worse than the known horror of the dungeon. You've become trapped not by chains and locks, but by economic necessity and the systematic destruction of your alternatives. You're a prisoner of your own employment, serving a sentence with no defined end date, hoping only that your breaking point arrives through something quick rather than the slow, grinding deterioration that you see in your veteran colleagues. The pit doesn't lead anywhere. It just gets deeper. The endings for medieval dungeon guards cluster around four primary categories, none of them pleasant, all of them arriving sooner than they would for people in virtually any other occupation. You're not wondering if something bad will happen. You're just waiting to discover which specific disaster will claim you. The optimists among your colleagues sometimes joke about retirement and old age, but everyone knows these are fantasies, comforting fictions that help you descend the stairs for one more shift. Reality offers you death from disease, death from violence, permanent disability, or psychological collapse. Choose your fate. Disease claims the majority of guards, though the specific pathogen varies. Remember that tuberculosis you've been breathing in since week 1? For many guards, it eventually becomes active, transitioning from latent infection to full symptomatic disease. You start losing weight despite eating normally, or what passes for normally in your malnourished existence. The cough that's been your constant companion for months intensifies, producing blood-streaked sputum that you try to hide from your supervisors because acknowledging serious illness means termination without severance. Night sweats drench your bedding. Fever comes and goes. You're dying slowly, publicly, obviously, and you keep working because stopping means starvation arrives faster than the tuberculosis can kill you. The plague offers a different trajectory. Faster, more dramatic, more likely to take multiple people simultaneously. You're working your shift when a prisoner develops the characteristic buboes, swollen, painful lymph nodes in the groin, armpit, or neck. By the next day, 3 more prisoners show symptoms. By the following shift, one of your fellow guards is feverish and complaining of swollen glands. The dungeon becomes a plague incubator, the dense population and poor ventilation creating ideal transmission conditions. You're exposed constantly, breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces, unable to maintain any meaningful distance from the infected. Some people survive plague, maybe 30 to 60% depending on the strain and treatment. But those aren't great odds, and medieval medical care for plague is spectacularly ineffective, ranging from useless to actively harmful. If plague takes you, the progression is brutal. After an incubation period of maybe 2 to 6 days, you develop sudden fever, chills, and weakness. The buboes appear, excruciatingly painful swellings that can grow to the size of eggs or even apples. Your skin might develop black patches from internal bleeding and tissue death, giving bubonic plague its Black Death nickname. Without effective antibiotics, which won't exist for another 600 years, you're facing roughly 50 to 60% mortality. You might linger for a week in increasing agony. You might develop the pneumonic form, where the infection reaches your lungs and kills you within days through respiratory failure. You might develop septicemic plague, where bacteria overwhelm your bloodstream and you die within hours as your organs shut down. Typhus, spread by the lice that infest your body and clothing, offers another fast-moving option. The disease begins with sudden high fever, severe headache, and confusion. A rash appears, typically starting on your trunk and spreading outward. You become delirious, possibly violent, definitely incapable of performing your job. Mortality rates for epidemic typhus range from 10 to 60% depending on the strain and your baseline health. Given that you're malnourished, chronically stressed, and probably hosting multiple other infections, your odds skew toward the worst end of that range. Death usually comes from organ failure, pneumonia, or simple cardiovascular collapse as your body systems shut down under the disease burden. The more mundane infections kill plenty of guards too. A simple cut from a rusty chain becomes infected. You treat it with whatever medieval wound care exists, maybe washing it with wine, applying herbal poultices, praying to Saint Roch who protects against plague. The infection spreads anyway because the wound keeps getting recontaminated in the filthy dungeon environment. You develop cellulitis, then lymphangitis with those characteristic red streaks running up your arm, then sepsis as bacteria enter your bloodstream. You become feverish, confused, eventually unconscious as your organs fail. Medieval people call this blood poisoning and understand it's usually fatal, but they have no effective treatments. Antibiotics that could easily cure this condition won't be discovered for centuries. You die from a minor injury that became major through environmental contamination and medical inadequacy. Violence accounts for the second largest category of guard deaths. Sometimes it's prisoners who kill you, an escape attempt that turns violent, a coordinated attack when you enter a cell alone, an opportunistic assault when you're distracted or weakened by illness. You've been careful, you've followed protocols, but one moment of inattention or one equipment failure is enough. A prisoner whose chains you thought were secure has been working on them for weeks. When you open the cell for meal delivery, he's free and armed with an improvised weapon, maybe a sharpened bone, a piece of broken metal, a heavy stone. The confined space of the dungeon prevents escape or effective defense. He kills you quickly if you're lucky, slowly if you're not, and then attempts an escape that probably fails but definitely leaves you dead on the stone floor. Sometimes your fellow guards kill you, either deliberately or through negligence that amounts to the same thing. Remember that colleague who threatened you when you wouldn't participate in his smuggling operation. Maybe he decides you're a liability and arranges an accident. A push down the stairs, a mistaken stabbing during a prisoner disturbance, leaving you alone with dangerous prisoners who've been promised rewards for eliminating you. Or maybe it's not murder but simple neglect. You call for backup during an emergency and no one comes because your colleagues don't like you or are drunk or simply couldn't be bothered. You die fighting prisoners alone while your supposed team is elsewhere, and the official report will say you failed to follow proper procedures rather than acknowledging that the system failed you. The dungeon structure itself kills guards through accidents that are inevitable given the working conditions. You're navigating stone stairs in darkness, carrying supplies or restraining a prisoner, and you miss a step. The fall breaks your neck or fractures your skull against stone, or injures you badly enough that you die later from complications. You're moving through a low corridor without adequate light and crack your head on a protruding beam or stone. You're working near a torch that ignites something flammable, dry straw, your clothing, a pocket of methane gas from decomposing waste, and the resulting fire spreads faster than you can escape through the maze of locked doors and narrow passages. Other guards have died this way. Your name will be added to the list. Disability that ends your employment but doesn't kill you immediately might be the worst outcome because it prolongs your suffering while eliminating your income. That respiratory infection you've been managing finally destroys enough lung tissue that you can't climb the dungeon stairs without stopping multiple times to catch your breath. You're fired for inability to perform basic duties and left to survive on begging or charity. Your damaged lungs ensuring you'll die young but not immediately. Or your vision deteriorates from years of darkness and torchlight and infection until you can barely see, making you unemployable for essentially any medieval work, turning you into a blind beggar haunted by memories of what destroyed your eyes. The psychological endings might not kill your body, but they kill everything else. You have a complete mental breakdown, what medieval people might call being possessed or moonstruck, and lose your ability to function in society. You might end up confined yourself, ironically becoming a prisoner in the type of facility you used to guard. Or you might survive on the margins, one of those visibly disturbed people that communities tolerate but avoid, talking to yourself, responding to hallucinations, living rough because you can't maintain housing or employment. Your family, if they haven't already abandoned you, watches helplessly as you deteriorate into someone they don't recognize. Some guards choose their own endings. The suicide rate among dungeon guards is difficult to document precisely because medieval record-keeping didn't systematically track such statistics, and because religious prohibition against suicide created strong incentives to classify deaths as accidental. But anecdotal evidence and the occasional explicit reference suggest that guards killed themselves at elevated rates compared to the general population. Hanging is most common, grimly appropriate given that you have access to chains and rope and isolated spaces. Some walk into rivers or off cliffs. A few provoke prisoners or colleagues into killing them, achieving suicide through proxy violence. Historians still argue whether medieval people experienced depression and suicidal ideation in ways comparable to modern populations, or whether different cultural and religious frameworks created different psychological experiences. The evidence suggests that while the language and conceptualization differed, the fundamental experience of unbearable psychological pain leading to self-destruction existed across historical periods. Dungeon guards working in conditions of chronic trauma, social isolation, and hopelessness would have been at elevated risk regardless of the historical framework for understanding their suffering. A few guards do survive and transition to other work, but survival might be overstating what happens to them. They're alive but broken, physically damaged, psychologically scarred, socially stigmatized. They take whatever work their damaged bodies can manage. Begging, simple labor, charity cases in monasteries or hospitals. They're not building new lives so much as existing in the aftermath of dungeon employment, waiting for the damage already inflicted to complete its work of killing them. The tuberculosis takes another decade, but it takes them. The chronic inflammation from years of parasite exposure manifests as organ failure in their 50s. The psychological trauma expresses itself through alcoholism or violence or simple inability to connect with other humans. They survive the job, but not really, not in any meaningful sense. The young guards, the ones who start this work in their 20s, rarely see 40. The older guards who started in their 30s or 40s usually don't make it 5 years. The actuarial math is brutal and consistent. Dungeon guard work reduces life expectancy by decades compared to other medieval occupations. You're spending your literal life burning through years of existence in exchange for subsistence wages and the privilege of continuing to suffer. The cost-benefit analysis is catastrophically negative, but you made the calculation when you were desperate and now you're trapped in the consequences. Some small number of guards do achieve what might charitably be called a good ending. They work just long enough to save money from corruption or legitimate wages. They maintain enough health and sanity to quit before the job destroys them completely. They successfully transition to other work or family support, and they live something resembling a normal lifespan despite the damage already inflicted. These individuals are rare enough to be noteworthy, lucky enough to be enviable, and smart enough to have escaped before the job took everything. Their existence proves escape is possible but doesn't change the fundamental reality that the vast majority of guards aren't this lucky or strategic or supported. You lying there thinking about this as you try to fall asleep, probably fall somewhere in the middle of the outcome distribution. Not the absolute worst, you weren't tortured to death by prisoners or died screaming from plague. But not good either. Maybe you lasted 2 years before the tuberculosis became too severe to hide and you were terminated. Maybe you worked 5 years before a fall in the darkness left you with a limp that prevented stair climbing and ended your employment. Maybe you managed 7 years before the psychological burden became unbearable and you simply stopped showing up, retreating into whatever family or community support existed. However it ended, you didn't get retirement or pension or honor or recognition. You got survival barely for a while until the accumulated damage from dungeon employment completed its work. The castle continues operating. The dungeon continues holding prisoners. New guards replace you, starting their own descent into the same pit that consumed you, making the same optimistic assumptions about survival that you once made. The system persists because society needs dungeons and dungeons need guards, and there are always desperate people willing to take the work regardless of the cost. Your suffering served a social function but earned you nothing durable or valuable. You were a consumable resource, used up and discarded, your brief time as a dungeon guard remembered by almost no one and honored by absolutely no one. And now the darkness is permanent. Not the temporary darkness of a shift that ends when you climb the stairs, but the final darkness that comes for everyone eventually. Though it came for you far sooner than it should have because you spent your time serving in hell's anteroom, breathing poison, witnessing horror, and slowly dying underground while the castle above continued its normal life, barely aware of your existence and completely indifferent to your suffering. The dungeon claimed you, as it claims everyone who serves it long enough. The only variable was which specific mechanism would complete your destruction. Now you know. The story is nearly finished now, and if you're still awake, that's okay too. You've walked through every miserable aspect of a job that destroyed nearly everyone who attempted it. You've felt the cold stone, smelled the overwhelming stench, heard the screaming, witnessed the disease and violence and despair. You've understood, perhaps more clearly than you wanted to, exactly why you wouldn't have lasted in that environment. No one really did. No one could. The job was impossible from the beginning, designed by accident or indifference to consume human beings and offer nothing in return except temporary postponement of starvation. You're safe now, though, far removed from medieval dungeons, lying somewhere comfortable, breathing clean air, experiencing none of the horrors that defined those guards' brief and miserable careers. Your life, whatever challenges it contains, is not that. Let that comfort settle over you like a blanket. Let the distance between yourself and those long-dead sufferers create a cushion of safety where sleep can finally find you. The dungeons are empty now, the guards long gone to whatever rest they found, and you're here in the present, where the darkness is voluntary and temporary, where the morning will bring light and fresh air and the simple, profound luxury of not being a medieval dungeon guard. Rest now. Let it all fade into the historical distance where it belongs, a story told and finished, no longer requiring your attention or concern. Sleep well.